Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm glad you all made it to join us today. So I'm gonna get us kicked off here. I have found numbers estimating that there are likely over 2,300 queer farmers in the US, although the exact number is unknown because the USDA Census of Ag, taken every 5 years and considered a comprehensive count of farmers and ranchers in the US, doesn't ask about gender or sexual identity. And when queer farmers are invisible, their specific needs just don't get addressed. I think about this issue a lot. I think that the USDA knows that it's disempowering for anyone to advocate for marginalized communities without us being included in their data. It clearly keeps us invisible. The USDA from the beginning has been structured to support what they call the family farm, but who gets to define what a family farm looks like? Think about how much harder we have to work when safety nets like crop insurance, disaster relief, and low interest loans aren't available because queer and other marginalized communities, including non-citizens, aren't included in their definitions of socially disadvantaged. I think we have so much to learn from queer and marginalized communities because the truth is current farming models and government supports aren't even working for traditional farms anymore. In this moment, I think it's really important for us to be leaning into a community, which can look like empowering our fellow workers to build equity through shared ownership. There are quite a few alternative models, both in legal structure and internal organizing, that we will all discuss in this session. We will also discuss how the current system shapes who can farm and who gets left out, and what policy areas may need to shift to provide more equal access to farm ownership for people who don't fit the mold. My name is Ivy North, and I'm one of the three of us that are facilitating this panel together for you all here at the Small Farms Conference. I work for the North Coast Growers Association in Humboldt County, and my role as the Agricultural Programs Director. And there I work to develop localized training programs for Humboldt and surrounding regions and connect critical services and funding opportunities to our small scale and socially disadvantaged farmers. Next, I welcome Ashton Ham and Rebecca North to introduce yourselves somewhat briefly, and thank you for being fellow moderators on this panel.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashton. I'm a worker owner at California's first architectural cooperative. I've done a lot of advocacy in both the architectural space and cooperative space around the need for more types of cooperatives, including a fellowship with the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops a couple of years ago. I've worked with many nascent organizations and small businesses thinking and strategizing about alternative models and structures such as the community land trust and different forms of co-ops. Our architecture practice works at the intersection of land and housing justice with community land trusts, tribes, nonprofits, and cooperatives across the state of California. I'm super excited to be here today to talk about alternative models in the agricultural space.
Thanks, Ashton. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca North. I'm the Executive Director of Ecological Farming Association. So we just had our 46th annual Eco Farm Conference down at Asilomar in Monterey, where we had about 1,500 farmers and ranchers and policy folks and soil scientists and students and eaters all gathered together. That is a big part of what we do at Ecological Farming Association is convene farmers and folks in the food world to provide resources for farmers and have that intergenerational exchange of knowledge happen. As we know, a lot of growers are aging out, and it's really important that we provide resources for all growers and especially beginning growers. And each year, I mean, I have been in the produce world for a number of years. I was on the operations, procurement, supply chain side for 25 years. I just came into this role 2 years ago, and I was on the planning committee for eco farm for like the last 15 years and would always put in a session about queer growers. And what's really neat is that, often in the beginning years of that, there would be a few of us in the room. And now there are just people spilling out of the rooms when we have these workshops. Point is, the demand is there. So huge props to CAF for considering this workshop and their partnership with EcoFarm and to Ivy and Ash. And it should be noted that Ivy and I are not related, which is surprising. I was surprised. I was like, Ivy, are we related? But it turns out we're not. But maybe somewhere in those 23,000 queer farmers that Ivy mentioned, they're, we're one big family. Go ahead, Ivy. I think I'll pass it back to you so we can introduce the rest of the folks.
We are one big family. We're cousins now. We're chosen family, Rebecca. I'm excited now to introduce our panelists. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. Dorian Payan is the Director of Holistic Land Relations and is a staff attorney who focuses on food systems work through the framework of agroecology. Dorian became a lawyer after years of working as a farmer and seeing a drastic need to support enterprises in developing cooperative ecosystems free from exploitation. Dorian's work is also focused on supporting the development of a land ethic that is based on rematriation and that can serve to create land relations where all people can belong to the land. Thank you for being here. And we have Augustine Vegas, the current project coordinator for Project Milpa, a collaboration between the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, cause, and the Mixteco Indigena Community Organizing Project, MICOP, and Líderes Campesinas, Project Milpa aims to advance environmental sustainability, racial equity, and economic transformation in the food system by establishing a farm worker cooperative and land trust to advance worker-owned regenerative ag in Ventura County. Augustine previously worked as a workers' rights attorney with Legal Aid Services of Oregon, Farm Workers' Rights Program, and is currently a fellow with the Sustainable Economies Law Center. What a great panel we have for you all. Thanks again for you both being here. And I will mention briefly that on Wednesday at 1:15, Dorian and Augustine will be on another panel talking about cooperatives. That one will be in Spanish, and we'll go ahead and put a link to that in the chat if any of you are interested in attending. And we will be, this will be a panel structure here. We're going to go back and forth with the panelists, and then we're going to leave a bunch of time at the end to have a good conversation and bring all of you attendees into it. If you have a question come up as we're talking, feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat or write it down for yourself, and we'll have time to discuss once we get to the end. Let's see, Rebecca. Do you feel good opening us up with some of our first questions?
Yeah. So we have prepared a couple of different questions for the panelists, for Dorian and Augustine. And I think to start, I was curious about what your current, your past, maybe even your future relationship to land and farming looks like. How does your work challenge the notion of a family farm? Dorian, I guess we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. And I just want to say, I mean, I'm also so curious about, you, Ivy, and Ashton. So it's like, I don't know, I'm inviting that subversion of like, I also want to hear from you all. But I can share a little bit. So as y'all mentioned, I'm currently at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, working as a staff attorney there. But that sort of happened by chance. It happened after a couple of years of farming, really set on that career. And then sort of season after season, just seeing the hurdles of what it meant to be able to make a career out of farming, especially not only a career, but also just really like align my lifestyle, align who I wanted to be and sort of how I wanted to exist in the world and how challenging that was. A lot of it was because of the legal infrastructure that we had in place. And so it was a lot of questions that I kept on running up against, and I wanted to learn more. It's sort of why I took the leap into this profession. I did it in a sort of punk rock way, I always say. I didn't go to law school. I did it by apprenticing, which is just basically accumulating the hours of shadowing under an apprentice, or shadowing under an attorney, and then eventually taking the bar. But my past was exactly that, farming full time. When I started farming, I actually did it as my second year of grad school. I didn't really come back. I was like, you know what? I think I need to do something a little different. I want to be in a different sort of relationship to the soil. And so I was, and I also didn't think that it was going to be queer farming that I would be doing. I definitely had these sort of two parts of my life kind of running parallel, but then I realized that they would actually just nourish one another, which is a really beautiful happening. I think to see that, sort of my sort of most authentic queer expression would happen on the farm, which is really sweet. And so, I did a farming for a couple of years. That was my past. I'm really also proud to say that, all the tractor work that I learned to do, and all the great work from like flower harvesting to crop planting was taught by other queer farmers, which is really just great. And I just love that, one of my favorite parts about being a farmer was just working on a tractor and, my mentor being like, all right, it's time to get butch, and like, let's get on the farm, let's get on the tractor and like, let's replace a band or something. So I just want to say that sort of like, that really informed a lot. And it just really, it really kind of gave me the space to ideate. Fast forward, I came into the work as an attorney, really wanting to think of like, what would it mean to hold the relationship to land that was maybe not what I saw at the moment, as a young farmer kind of being proposed. Of course, we know this sort of big transitioning happening. The average age of the farmer is 58 and getting older. And a lot of people are talking about like, what does that great transition mean? I always say I was a little alarmed when I saw that a lot of the sort of images, these, although bucolic images, were also sort of at the fear of like replicating a lot of these settler fantasies that I actually didn't necessarily want to move towards. And so part of my learning of becoming a lawyer was also thinking of like, what other ways can we exist on the land, and what sort of legal infrastructure do we need to be able to navigate through that? Not sort of the legal piece being the end, but really like just being the tool to navigate that puzzle. And so a lot of the work that I do now, or maybe up until now, was really sitting with this idea of rematriation. I think as I was farming too, I was sort of developing this understanding of what it meant to be in right relationship to the land, and then realizing that I think, rematriation was really the path that I wasn't necessarily being spoken about as we were talking about land transitions. And so when I came into being an attorney, I actually didn't jump right into agriculture directly. I actually jumped more into like working with indigenous nations, in California, which is actually a really interesting mosaic. I mean, because the sort of history of California Native nations this year is really special, really particular. You're sort of navigating federal Indian law, but other times you're not. And so I learned a lot, and I felt like I wanted to sort of take that longer arc, because I wanted to know that when I came back into working more directly with agriculture, that I had that understanding of like, what does it mean to align myself in my work with rematriation? So that's sort of the work that I'm doing into the future, coming back into agriculture strongly. Still work with some tribes, but definitely pivoting the work more directly into agriculture, which is sweet. Agustina and I have been sort of working together, as colleagues in this cooperative ecosystem. And so, yeah, it was really funny that we're also going to have another panel together on Wednesday. But that's sort of the future, is just, harvesting the learnings of working with our indigenous clients, and then using that, to serve as the foundation of what does it mean to be able to farm, through a lens of rematration or farm and right relationship. So yeah, I can leave it there. But that's sort of my past, my present, my future.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And Augustine, how about you?
Yeah, thank you for a great question, and thank you, Dorian, for sharing. So currently, I'm a coordinator of a project called Project MILPA, where we're establishing a worker-owned cooperative with farm workers in Ventura County. So helping farm workers transition from worker to ownership, as well as access to land. And when I say farm worker, I'm talking about a particular group of folks who are field laborers and smaller farmers, or smaller farms up to large corporate farms, folks who are a lot of times monolingual Spanish speakers or monolingual indigenous language speakers, or bilingual migrant and seasonal farm workers. So that's kind of the project that we have right now. And currently I also have a plot in a community garden. So that's kind of a smaller scale, just entry into folks farming. My kind of past relationship is my father and his side of the family were farm workers, and have always been farmers. They're from Mexico, and they had their own farm. And whenever they migrated, whether within Mexico or to the US, they always had a garden that they either used to grow food for themselves or food to sell. So even being a farm worker all day, they would come home and still farm. So instead of farming for someone else, they were farming for themselves. And right now, my aunts and uncles have a plot that they farm on, and it's kind of cool because I'll hear my dad just talking about growing like flowers and be like, "Oh, your uncle grows these huge flowers. I don't know how he did it. He must be using something." So it's just kind of cool to hear like people talk about growing flowers in that context. And then I think my future relationship to it is the work that I'm doing, I feel like is very systems change. I kind of came into this work growing up seeing my dad and family be farm workers, growing up seeing, I think, that perspective of what it is to be an employee in a low wage working job. In a lot of places that they were farming were large scale farms. And moving into like workers' rights, that's what I kind of first gravitated towards, is working with farm workers in cases like wage theft or retaliation or sexual harassment, all of these things that are common within that field. And then being in that space and being like, okay, we need workers' rights, but I think another important piece to that is worker ownership, and kind of transitioning into that in the last few years. And how do I think that the work we're doing right now is creating worker-owned cooperative, and how that challenges the notion of the family farm. And I mean, we're creating a business within the community. We have 15 leaders from 3 different organizations that are spending a lot of time to create this business amongst themselves. Folks aren't related in the sense of blood, like we might think of as in a family farm, but they're folks coming from the community, from different places in the community, that are trying to create this farm together. And I'm hoping to see more of that in the future. I'm hoping to see more of these communal spaces where we're doing systems change, where we're taking space away from corporate ag and putting it back into the community. So yeah, appreciate it. And I'll pass it back on to the moderators.
Thank you. That's great. And thank you for touching on that what family farm might mean to you, what some of those assumptions are that come with it, and how those assumptions affect your work in your community. What would you identify as the biggest barrier for small farmers today, just in like one or two words? Dorian, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Augustine, and then we'll pass it back to Ashton.
Yeah, in one or two words, I'd say land access, definitely. I think is a big one. How about you?
Yeah, land access. We to start our project, we did a report where we interviewed 76 different farm workers from across the county, Ventura County. Number one issue amongst all of them in trying to attain farm ownership was land access. Other things that folks mentioned were restrictions due to immigration status. For farm workers, half of all farm workers don't have work authorization. So that's a really big barrier. Also access to business development resources and training. Just learning how to run a business in the US. But yeah, definitely land access is the biggest one. I'll pass it back to Ashton.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great segue as we kind of are thinking about some alternative models to land and access. And I guess I'm a little curious. I don't know that folks in this space are that familiar with some of these alternative models of land trusts and how that work. And so I'm kind of curious if maybe Dorian, you can kick us off in maybe sharing a little bit about some of these alternative ownership models that may be working for some queer-led farms. And then Augustine, maybe you can fill in with a little bit more specifics around how that works for you all.
Totally. Yeah. So one of the fun things that we do at the Law Center is, despite being often in a room full of lawyers when you have a consultation with us, we try to de-emphasize the legal relationship, and how that sort of shapes how people come together and organize with each other. So we really like to start with the relationship piece and say, what is it that you all are either already doing with each other or wanting to do with each other, and in what ways can we sort of bring the sort of legal scaffolding so that you're still able to do that. Of course, there's always a trade-off with engaging in some sort of entity, like a co-op or like an LLC or land trust. But it's just, I say this point to say that no one entity is going to give you the ideal relationship, and a lot of the times, which is both I think a benefit and sometimes a disadvantage, but it's great that you're able to bring the relationship and you can actually see it flourish in different relationships. So in some of the queer farms that I've seen thrive, often it's been the nonprofit model that's worked, right? Because it's more expansive. It sort of has different sources of funding that allows the idea of farming to be more expansive, to operate at a different pace. And then also to be aligned with a larger sort of community mission, which is to, if a nonprofit is aligned in a particular way, can meet different goals, right? That align things such as queer stewardship and ecological stewardship, together. So nonprofits. Interestingly, I'm thinking of like some of the most the more famous farms like Rocksteady in Millerton. I believe they're a nonprofit, and one of the farms that I worked with, where my mentor and manager, was a trans-mask farmer. That was actually a conservation land trust. That was actually a 501c3, so a nonprofit. So I've actually seen that really like hold a lot of those relationships. But of course, there's also like the cooperatives, I think, and the LLCs and the land trusts. I'll say that, a cooperative, of course, I think in our imagination is when, people come together, and work together, usually in a flat sort of organizational structure so that there's no boss, I'll say that that's a great structure generally. I mean, I think historically, if we look at queer land projects, they already naturally orient in that direction. And I would say that depending on the sort of economic like necessity of the project, LLCs can also accommodate that. So I've also seen some LLCs that operate as a cooperative, even though they're structured as an LLC. But back to the co-op piece, I'm thinking of Humble Hands Harvest, for example, in Decorah, Iowa. And it's funny, I'm saying a lot of these out-of-state examples, but it's kind of nice, right, to sort of take us outside of California a little bit and see what's happening. I love Humble Hands because they're right in the middle of the Midwest. I think are doing remarkable work in one of the most ecologically altered regions in the country, right? Iowa is what they call it, and so they use a cooperative model that actually allows community buy-in, and then also allows for the land to be held in what they call the commons. And so that's actually been a model that I've seen has been creative and effective, and I think supports the queer farmers that started the project, but is also embracing of the community at large. So I can sort of pause there. Those are some of the examples that I've seen for sure.
Yeah, and I can just follow up on some of the things that Dorian mentioned. Not getting too much into the weeds, but Dorian was talking about cooperatives that are actually an LLC that function as a cooperative. You can take these cooperative principles or these structures and then put them onto other entities like a LLC. So you can figure out what the entity that works best for you, but if you want to, you can embody these principles in multiple ways. And I think we're also talking a lot about like kind of two areas of work where you can have these alternative models. There's like the working area where your production side, and then also your land access. So those are two areas, especially I think that we're talking about in this conference, in this workshop, that you can kind of divide up if you want to think about it, if it's kind of a whole lot. But yeah, kind of the worker side and then the land ownership side. I think that's all I got to add for right now.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I guess maybe kind of a little bit more functionally with some of these alternative model structures. I know that like land ownership today is sometimes completely out of the question, even when you do have a group of folks who have a shared mission or goal. And so I kind of have like a two-pronged question here, which is one, is like a cooperative model or a nonprofit like an easier way to get access to land if ownership is the actual like end goal? And if not, are there like some ideas you all have for more equitable or like radical lease terms that folks can kind of be advocating for when they're talking about organizing in these alternative modes under, what we kind of understand as our, current land holdings today? So maybe I'll switch it up and say, Augustine, do you want to take that question first?
Yeah, and Dorian is the practicing lawyer here, so I'm hoping I'm not saying things that are incorrect. But I think that if we're talking about land access with the hope of land ownership, I think if we're thinking about a land trust, which it is a nonprofit, it's a nonprofit that's just focused on purchasing and maintaining land. The ownership isn't going to lie with the farmer. The ownership is most likely going to lie with the nonprofit. So the most experience I've seen is with like community land trust focused on residential housing, where folks will receive a house that's part of a land trust. One of the drawbacks, though, is that you're not getting the same type of investment as if you owned the land. So that's just one thing to be aware of. You'll be able to access land. The idea is you can access land at a cheaper rate, but whenever you leave, that land will go back to the community land trust for the community. There might be other models. Dorian, please add them if you know other models. But that particular route might not be for if the farmer wants farm ownership themselves, which farmers use land ownership as an investment too, right? It can help in a exit plan or succession plan that is value that you're able to sell and then have a retirement plan with, right? So I think that's one thing to note about the community land trust, to know when you're renting land from that particular area that it might not be for ownership for yourself. In terms of equitable or adequate lease terms, what I've seen is that like people can create the relationship that they want to with themselves as long as they're following certain legal things. But you can have a lease contract that isn't meant to be as extractive as other types of landlord-tenant relationships. It could be like a shared use agreement, or it could be something that you're intentional about saying, we want these people to have access to the land because we believe in their mission. So I think those are some ways that you can kind of bake in these kind of radical ideas. Even though like a shared use agreement shouldn't be that radical, right? Like, yeah. Dorian, do you want to add anything to that?
Okay, I think you did a great job at covering those. I mean, as I'm thinking of the lease terms, I'm thinking of course, being able to keep the improvements as well, sort of the investment of the improvements, I think, is one thing that I've heard from many, farmers, is that you want to have a deep relationship with the land. You also want to create the infrastructure so that you're able to farm in the way that you need to. And sometimes there's a fear that if you put some sort of capital investment on the land, that you won't be able to recover that at the end of the term. So that's something, is like creating favorable terms in that way. On the more radical side, of course, I'm always sort of encouraging the relationship to form, so that there's like a mutual goals between, who currently holds title to the land, the title holder, the landowner, and also the farmers. And I think that's usually the best scenario. Some of the considerations that I'm also thinking of too is, in particularly in the state of California, an agricultural lease can't be more than 51 years. So getting creative around those terms of like, what does it mean to leave a 50-year legacy? And like, how are we going to shape maybe the relationship that we want to have each other within that time frame? It's always kind of nice, when you put a sort of 50-year vision of the land or something, it really kind of encourages people to think, okay, like, what is my trajectory? What is it that I'm moving towards? And so I've sort of seen, maybe that's sort of outside of the lease, but really like what insulates the lease relationship as it's forming is also just as important. And then, I think to to what Augustine was saying, the land trust model has been something that I've seen. Of course, any land trust is going to have a board of directors. That's technically the people that are going to be responsible for upholding the mission of the land trust. And so you can create a land trust to where the board members are actually representative of this, and they're actually really well informed of what does it mean to create a safe space, for queer farm stewards, and like how can that be like a sort of imperative role of the land trust. More traditional roles that I've seen have been using the very same LLC, as being the sort of landholding vehicle, and then each sort of member has a share in the LLC, or creating something that's called like a joint tenancy, or like a tenancy in common, where multiple people sort of go and put their name together on a title. The challenge of that, of course, is like, when acquiring a mortgage, I think that can be challenging sometimes. It's becoming more common, but sometimes lenders don't really know how to interact with that. And I mean, I think that just falls in line with, I think as we've seen in the literature, when dealing with like agencies, not only government agencies, but other sort of agencies that work in the service of farmers, that people don't really understand sometimes, like queer kinship structures, for example. And they don't know, like, why is it that like, 3 people are in the title? Like, what does this mean? And how is this sort of dissonant to what they're used to, which is maybe like a family farm structure? But yeah, I would say so. Those are some of the examples that I can think of as well.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like, there needs to be some further education around the idea of non-nuclear families and the queer family and the possibilities of expansive ownership relationships, to kind of have this like dual feedback of understanding both from lenders and support organizations, when we talk about and think about how we can co-own things together and build shared equity. Um, I'm going to pass it to Ivy to lead the next section of questions.
Thank you. Our next section focuses on alternatives and possibilities. And I'm going to combine a couple questions that we had prepared you for. So we just had some good conversation about alternative ownership structures, co-ops, community land trusts, LLCs, and collectives were all mentioned. From your experience, is there one of these models that offers more promise over the other? And also, what trade-offs come with these alternatives that people should be honest about? Anybody like to go first? All right, oh, great. Augustine, thank you.
I'll take this one just because Dorian's answered first for the majority for the last question. Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess I'll talk more about the promises or the drawbacks. Like with our project, we're starting a worker-owned co-op, and for us, that is the one that shows promise. That's the form of collective ownership that shows promise in our area because it is community leaders from, I guess, different organizations coming together to create community ownership. But one of the drawbacks is you're working with a big group of people. If you're working with anybody besides yourself, you're most likely going to have conflict at some point. And you got to learn how to deal with that conflict. You have to learn how to work through the conflict and then get to the other side. So that is kind of one of the difference than a farm. If you're kind of the sole proprietor, or if you're the main person or the owner, that you have to make collective decisions. You have to figure out how to do that. In our project, we have multiple languages that people are using, so we have to have interpretation present. We have to have childcare present at all our meetings for folks to be able to participate fully. We provide. We're a nonprofit. We're able to get funding, but we provide food too because it's people's time that they're giving to this project. And then I think for us as well, the community land trust model is what we're aiming for. The price of land here in Ventura County, it varies in where you're at, but in the most profitable areas, it can be up to $4,000 an acre, especially where most of the workers live in Oxnard. So that's where they live, that's where the most work is, and not a lot of folks can afford having even a small scale farm in this area. So having some type of form of land access is what works best for us, and in this moment at least. Yeah, I can pass it on to Dorian.
Yeah, thank you, Agustin. I guess I can just sort of touch a little more on a subject that we touched on earlier, which is the idea of equity. And I think that's one thing that is always sort of being weighed for or against when you're using one model versus the other. So when you're using models that are outside of the nonprofit structure, like an LLC, a co-op, you can always structure how equity works. Like, if you're maybe a part owner of a business or of a land project, you can always structure how what you're able to walk away with if you ever have to exit the project. So that is flexible, of course, in some ways. And so with nonprofits, even though I've sort of mentioned that a lot of the times they can be a little more expensive, there's that piece, right? That, we're translating individual equity into community equity, essentially, right? Because it's like being held as a community piece. but even then, that can be challenging for the day-to-day operation of a farm, right? So like sometimes if you're trying to operate on land that's held by a land trust, you can run into things like unrelated business tax income. So like the nonprofit trying to seek tax exempt advantages actually doesn't end up acquiring those, because a lot of the times, you're having to create a business plan, you're having to farm for the very sake of like feeding your community and like making a profit off of that. And so our legal systems are super awkward in that way, and that like there's a sort of domain that's like nonprofit, charitable, and it's kind of hard to interface it sometimes with the more practical, like profit oriented pieces of running a business or being a farmer. And so a lot of the fun work there is having, curious arrangements to make those work with each other. And yeah, it can be challenging sometimes. So, a lot of the times, the sort of LLC, the co-op, the more for-profit oriented models are simpler in that way because you're able to sort of do more. But again, you're risking, again, just having to like have financial barriers that maybe you'd be able to alleviate by like having grants through a nonprofit or something. Yes, I generally say those are sort of the big like advantages and downsides of the two. The nonprofit is good for the funding piece, but can be limited in activities. The for-profit is maybe more financially strained, but has more freedom in what you're able to do in terms of farming activities.
Thank you for all that. I noticed, Dorian, that you mentioned that our legal system is awkward, and I think that that's a generous understatement. But that leads well into my next question, which is what policy areas would need to shift to areas would we need to shift to understand these models and provide equal access to large scale farms. So just thinking about the policy that exists, is not set up for cooperatives, certainly not worker owned businesses. Um, what do you see maybe what's possible reasonably, and maybe isn't going to happen, but could be glorious if we could really move towards it. Just thinking about policy change. Do you mind starting on that, Dorian?
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is a funny question because I felt like I was sitting with this question for the last couple of years. I was part of this land equity task force and we had to write a report, and it never got any less awkward, right? Because you're sort of, at the one time, you're trying to secure generational wealth. You're trying to sort of support people in developing these systems of equity so that they're able to compete in a very unfair market. At the same time, too, you're not trying to sort of push people too much into the status quo so that these problems have more people that perpetuate these cycles, right? So like you're sort of trying to support people in exiting the very systems that like make everything so challenging. So the first thing that does come from me top of mind is definitely, when it comes to land access, like how can we maximize just the ability for people to be on the land in various different configurations? One thing that I've been keen on and that I've started to explore increasingly is the access of public lands for farming. And it's a strange thing to sit with, especially in a panel of queering the farm and queer farming in general, because of course, if we look at the lineage, the queer genealogy, it's been very reluctant to engage with the state, in the way that maybe like a policy like this would invite us to do. But I do remain hopeful that when it's held public, we're sort of inviting this idea of the commons again. And I think that's really where my sort of imagination goes towards, because we're looking at just like exorbitant prices of land, and absent of like just finding all the money we need to then purchase the land, it's like, what vehicles can we do to both secure land right now, but also make sure that our future generations of farmers can actually be able to have land that they can farm on. So that would be like my policy, is like, how do we increase sort of the public infrastructure for farming, because I think it's important for all of us to be able to access that. I think it's valuable, right? I mean, that's essentially what changed me, is like just being able to be on the land beyond ideating, like having the space to actually be on the land was super important to me. Yeah, check.
Thank you for that. Yeah, your work on the Land Equity Task Force really primed you for that one. But I also really appreciate hearing your individual perspectives and conclusions on that as well. I'm really interested in that report, and we've put it in the chat if anybody here would like to check that out. There's a lot of good, solid research and solid ideas proposed in there. Augustine, what do you have on this? Do you want me to repeat the question at all?
Yeah, no, I think I got it. Thank you, though. Yeah, I think if we're talking about like land access, I think some of the barriers that I really see is like one is like the starting point of actually being able to purchase the land, and then an ending point being a way to hold the land, and then maybe like a middle point, like some type of intermediary, somebody that might be doing the work of from purchase to holding the land. And I guess to kind of describe those a little bit more, and this suggestion actually comes from the Land Task Force recommendations, but having some type of first opportunity to purchase act, where if a piece of land becomes available or for sale, a certain group of folks might have access to purchasing that before a larger group of folks, and those might be folks that are current farmers, might be worker-owned cooperatives, might be nonprofits, but some type of mechanism to help people kind of in front of the sale and to purchase it. In terms of an intermediary, our project actually kind of started out of public parks and green spaces. That's where we got a lot of our funding to start this project. And so we're exploring a lot of different ways that communities are trying to access green space. And one of those is land banks, or these kind of like, they can either be part of the government or they can be quasi government, but they're meant to purchase land, which could come from like pieces of land that didn't pay their taxes or and other ways come back to the state. And then the point is to sell it at a lower point. Or sorry, sell it to a lower, like at a lower price. And that could be a form of like selling it to a potential land trust, which would be something that could hold it. I saw a question in the chat. Policy mechanism. Yes, first right of refusal. Yeah, it's the same. And some people say that, some people say first opportunity to purchase, but and then I think in terms of the worker co-ops, what I've seen is we recently applied for a grant through the California Seed Grant, which is meant for businesses, particularly businesses that might have folks who come from different communities, including communities that don't have work authorization or folks who are undocumented, and like specifically naming that. And within that grant, it's also, there's specific money for worker-owned cooperatives as well. So like I think building that into policy, having spaces where it's a specific pot of money for that specific thing really helps out, instead of trying to compete with bigger pots. Yeah, okay, I'll just leave it there. But I think those are some policy things that could change.
Much appreciated. Thank you both for your thoughtful answers there. Rebecca, I'm gonna toss it to you for a little lightning round before we jump into Q&A.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, I think all of those policy resources and ideas are fantastic. And I'm also wondering what advice, just in a couple of sentences, what one piece of advice or resource for queer farmers just starting out what you would recommend to them. Augustine, you seem like you're really thinking, so Dorian, I'll have you go first.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would want to offer people what was offered to me. Definitely the spaces to do that, to be able to do land stewardship at a different place. And so I think that, that's why I come back to why land access is so important. If there's more land access, and of course, I'm hoping there's also more queer land projects. If there's more queer land projects, and there's a way that is non-alienating for queer farmers to engage with this idea of being able to steward on land. So I think that is that would be my recommendation. Is definitely how do we proliferate queer land projects? Yeah.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead,
think.
Augustine.
Oh, thank you. I think my answer is a little bit lensed from kind of the farm worker perspective, in that like folks engaging in farming, just knowing that like there's interlocking identities coming into this space, that there's this whole corporate ag structure that it thrives on the exploitation of black and brown bodies, which include queer communities within those communities. And that is a very real part of agriculture as well. But it's a space where folks can organize as well, bring in coalitions. We're all facing issues of access to land as well, trying to create better work systems for ourselves. So just understanding that other piece that's going on right now, and it's like an international piece. Like the labor flow doesn't start in the U.S. It starts in other countries where there are labor practice issues as well. So there's an international struggle in there as well. But just kind of keeping that bigger picture in mind.
Yeah. So it almost sounds to me like something that might be helpful is some sort of list of ally farms, or farms that have space that could rent out or lease land that have been vetted in some way to be BIPOC inclusive, to be queer safe spaces. I'm not sure who would be doing that work. Maybe that's something Kath and I need to talk about as like a combo project. So we might be talking, Evan. So that's really, yes, I think there, so it sounds like there is possibility and opportunity for sure. And I think we can leave it there because Ivy, I think we talked about the future pieces kind of in the beginning. I think it would be a good time to do some Q&A, I think.
Sure, sure. I would love that. And I'm so curious to hear from the audience. And depending on how many questions we get there, we certainly have quite a bit we could talk about amongst ourselves, or other questions that we weren't able to pull up for time. Ash, do you have any ideas on how to get this section going?
Yeah, I mean, I think if folks want to either raise their hand or start putting some questions in the chat, I am seeing some pop up. I think before, I wonder if Dorian and Augustine, if you all have questions for each other, before we kind of hop into audience questions, maybe like one question, but we can also jump right into audience questions or bop back and forth between all of those things.
Go ahead, Agustin.
I was just saying I don't have a question for Dorian yet, but I'm gonna think one.
Yeah, ditto. I was gonna say, I feel like most of them would be leading questions because I kind of, know Agustin a little. So yeah. So maybe I'll hold for now too.
Yeah, okay, let's hop into some audience questions. I see a hand raised from trans people. You are muted. Oh, a whole
Yes,
crew.
hello.
Hello.
Sorry, we have a whole crew.
Love it.
I had a question, and then you can tell me about how we can go about, because I think other folks might have questions, or did I read that wrong? Okay. I had a question which kind of came up with Augustine. And if you want to speak on this, that would be great. But with your last bit of advice of just like keeping this in the back of your mind, of remembering like exploitation when it comes to like labor and like Black and brown bodies and like the workers. Um, in planning on participating in like land projects such as this, like how do we ensure that like native stewardship on the land is prioritized and actively happening? How do we like either give land back to local tribe members or make sure that members of the tribes in the region also benefit and are nourished by the land project, whether you've come and like have already experienced doing that or like ideas of doing that? Because that's something when I came into this and watching it, it's like I would want to know about that because purchasing land in the system that we are in, we are also purchasing it within that system of like capitalism. And it's like, how do we also remember that part of it too? Check for that.
Before anyone answers, huge shout out to all y'all for getting together and being here. That is so amazing. Okay, carry on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I hope Dorian adds to this because I think Dorian has worked more directly on this. But Dorian mentioned this concept earlier of rematriation, and this idea of restoring land to indigenous folks, but also like the relationship between land and indigenous folks. And there's a land trust. Oh, okay. Before I go, Project Milpo, we kind of have this interesting issue where about half of our group is indigenous folks from Mexico. And what does that mean to be an indigenous person and come into another space and purchase land that has been stolen from other indigenous folks? And so kind of balancing that idea and what it looks like to have a system where we're repatriating land or working with local tribes. I think that's, or folks who aren't tribal as well. I think that's really important. There's a land trust in the Bay Area called the Segurite Land Trust that works on land rematriation. That's kind of where we got our first start into looking into that idea. But to be honest, we haven't moved much forward as a project. We're still trying to form the business, still trying to find land. But that needs to be a part of our conversation as we go forward with that. I'll pass it on to Dorian to add, and hopefully add.
Yeah, thank you, Agustin. Shout out to Segurite. Also, yeah, and shout out to this group. I saw the name like camera off. I was like, trans people, like presente, like hell yeah. So it's just sweet to like then go camera on and be like, oh, okay, yeah, we weren't kidding. So it was sweet. Yeah, I mean, I think just going on Augustine's point, that's exactly why I sort of took this sort of, detour, because I was seeing that. I was like, where is the rematriation conversation happening? And as we're talking about land access, like how as this big transition of aging farmers is happening, how is that, being seen as an opportunity so that rematriation can actually sit as the foundation for land relations as we move forward? And so I think that's one thing that I think about a lot. I mean, even just reflecting on the term rematriation, I think it's always good to bring, I appreciate Segurite for really like supporting the popularization of that framework, because it does, switch from this idea of like repatriation, right? And it's like a lot of what queer farming sort of is a respite of is like heteropatriarchy. And so Segurite's sort of idea is that repatriation is a return of objects, yes, sure, but rematriation is a return of relationships, of like these indigenous relationships to the land that were actually what nourished the land and what like really sustained the land. And so I just really, really love that piece. And I also just want to shout out, the term rematriation is both feminist and gender neutral, right? So everyone can rematriate in that sense. And so I think it's just a really beautiful thing to think about. In terms of how to be in right relationship, I just want to say, humility and time, in order to distill it is like what it takes a lot of. I think a lot of folks are really anxious to really be in right relationship, with the people whose ancestral lands they're on. Um, and which is great. There's a lot of momentum around it, but sometimes that can also be really overwhelming to folks because they're just fielding so many requests. And so a lot of it is just really sitting with like, what is it the project that you're involved with? And in what ways can I make an offering, as a guest on this land, I think is so important. Because I think sometimes people, want to be like, what can we do? Like, we're here, we want to be in right relationship. And sort of coming with that, that sort of like yearnful anxiety can sometimes be, I wouldn't say counterproductive, but can be a little overwhelming sometimes. So I think, if there's a queer land project in particular, really just situating yourselves like, what does it mean for me to be in right relationship? How can I make an offering, and how can I be part of what advances rematriation? Because I think that's also one thing that I've appreciated about rematriation, that it's not close, to just to the nations whose land we steward on. It's actually meant to be something that benefits us all. And so I really just I really drive sort of with that, and it's sweet. I mean, it's humbling. Like Sogorate is actually one of our clients at the Law Center, and so we've been in relationship with them for years, and I'm still learning every day. So yeah, just practicing what a colleague of mine, Emily Burgueño, calls cultural humility is always important for me to just remember. And she distinguishes that from like cultural competence, right? 'Cause she's like, you can never maybe entirely be competent in another culture, but you can have the humility to know that you will learn deeply and also be in that point of like constant learning. So yeah, I'll just offer that. Thank you for that question.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks. I also kind of want to chime in here because a lot of our clients are tribes, and we also have a lot of folks who aren't organized as tribes but ha want to have a relationship. And we're also working with Segorite on some projects in Oakland. And I guess I kind of want to offer like the getting involved. Segorite has work days at their sites that have been returned often, and I think that there's oftentimes like an intention of like, without actually like having interpersonal relationships with the folks whose land you're on, like wanting to kind of get involved or like have some sort of relationship. And I guess I want to offer that they often have like work days or ways that you can kind of get more familiar with their organizations. And I think to Dorian's point, it can be overwhelming, I think, to kind of come in and want to like initiate or offer some sort of transaction when they're quite busy with other things going on. So I would say like kind of get a sense of what's going on locally with folks and see kind of what can happen, and maybe you build some interpersonal relationships that can like form longer term relationships and invitations of exchange. I wonder if y'all had other questions. It sounds like you might have.
Oh, we were asking on how to spell, but we found out how that way. Is there a question? Oh my gosh, you get so many queers in a room where we have so many brains. One sec. I think we will raise our hand again, but you can move on. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Are there any other folks who have questions? I think I saw some people go off camera briefly, but feel free to raise your hand or throw a question in the chat. I guess I can kind of prompt a question here. I think it's maybe like pivoting on that question that was just raised around right relation and like this idea of like gatekeeping land. It's like you as a a queer land project, have worked so hard, and I think even the question today is like is ownership not even only possible or, is it desirable kind of in the system that we have? And we've done all this work to come up with an alternative model, whether it is a land trust or something else. And, like we've worked so hard to get here. Like, what is this relationship to kind of like, yeah, our community at large? I think there's often also a draw to kind of be these like self-sufficient land projects, right? That are like, historically we have like the Back to the Land movement where it's like, okay, we're like just creating our own like subculture here. And so I guess I wonder if you all have some ideas for this version of Queer Land Project and like land access with these alternative models that isn't so like isolating and can be like very inviting and inclusive to, Indigenous folks and the folks who aren't necessarily like working on this land.
I I think from my end, access to land also means access to green space, and that can be either like a an alternative to revenue stream. You can provide access to green space for folks who might be children or families, or maybe even if you have a conference room for folks that want to be in a space that is being actively farmed or stewarded, or your ability to potentially steward the surrounding land. One of the places that we were looking to rent from is the Nature Conservancy, who has some farmland but traditionally work in environmental stewardship. And so maybe there's a combination there where the folks who rent the land can also steward the land or the surrounding areas. What was the other part of your question? Sorry, that's the part I gravitated towards.
I think are there like some mechanisms to kind of like that you may be using that are inviting folks outside like larger community kind of into your land project. And I know that you guys are still working towards land acquisition, but just if that is even a desirable, situation at this point in your organization's moment.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing and pass it on to Dorian. But I do think that small scale localized operations work best. I've seen community land trusts that get huge, and they become unmanageable, and then you end up having I think with anything that gets too big, the same issues of, do you really have ownership in that space, or is the ownership held within a small group of folks? Yeah, and I'll pass it on to Dorian.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm trying to like source my heart because I was like, well, be careful if you bring volunteers on the land. Make sure that you have, like I don't know, like it, because that's so real sometimes, right? And I think that's one of the great things of like community, like land tenure, like a nonprofit, is that you're able to engage with volunteers and communities more freely. Versus if you're a business, if you bring someone on the land, you might be breaking labor, like laws, or there might be liability issues. And so just kind of getting creative with that. Yeah, we actually, one of the queer land projects that we work with, when they bring volunteers on the land, we have this liability love letter that we call it, that if they want to sign it, it's basically saying, dear land project, like, I love you. And if I get hurt on the land, I know it's not on you. I promise to be careful, sort of. So just kind of that invitation of like, there's always risk on the land, but let's like not make it be all about liability. But I don't know. I just want to just generally say I appreciate the question, because I think, it is a different moment, right? I mean, I think for very, very necessary reasons, I think that sort of the Back to the Land movement, the sort of lesbian commune movement was like super important, as a sort of antidote. But I think it just by very nature of a farm, I mean, there is a social piece there, right? I think that we can't sort of insulate from and escape from. And so I'm always thinking of like, yeah, how do you engage with other like agencies or nonprofits that maybe are geared towards bringing people together, so that also one organization isn't having to do it all. I think that's if I always want to say one thing to any food systems related work is like, how do we not put it all on one entity to do, right? And so I think that's also part of the cooperative spirit, right? And it's also like it goes against this like hetero patriarchal grit of like having to want to do it all yourself. So it's like, how do you lean on other organizations to maybe do the hosting for you, and then you do the teaching. So yeah, just leaning into community as always, of course. Yeah, check.
Yeah, I love that. And like in the vision of a solidarity economy, we've got the cooperative infrastructure that we can like share and lean on as a community. And your farm is the one that we're hosting the event at, but we're cooking it in this, commercial kitchen over there. I don't know. It's like I think that there's a really robust vision out there that is in the works. We've got just 1 minute left, and I see the trans people crew is with hand raised. So maybe y'all can share this question, and we can try to get it in this last moment.
And then how about just real quick before you ask that question, if anybody else, let's see. When I opened up, I don't recall if I specifically mentioned that we're going to send out a resource list after this workshop to anybody who, I think it will go to anybody who selected this as part of their schedule, whether they attended or not. So with that said, our list is somewhat limited. I love folks that have been adding things to the chat. If anybody has any favorite resources relating to any of the topics that we've shared here, if you'd like to put it in the chat, we would very much welcome that and include it in our resources. Okay, back to you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the resource list. That's going to be really, really helpful. So thank you. But we had a question about more specifically joint tenancy and tenancy in common. Y'all kind of talked about some of the difficulties with like mortgages. Can you speak to some of the other difficulties going with like maybe going that route with like land access?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try and be quick. Oh, goodness. Okay, so tenancy in common, I believe, what happens is once one of the sort of like title holders of the land passes away, they they immediately have their land go to one of their successors. The tenancy in common is a little different. It's basically like, and so that's like the main difference between joint tenancy and tenancy in common. It's basically like who the land goes to upon the death of a title holder. And so just wanting to make sure, like, especially if you're thinking of long-term stewardship of land, like who do you want this land to go to? And depending on who it goes to, making sure that that relationship just maybe is it able to continue upholding the sort of intent of why, this group of people was able to buy land together. I'm trying to think of other challenges. I think that would be the main one. It's just kind of seeing like, the sort of successor. I mean, because of course you're having to navigate the law of like who inherits what after, the passing of someone. And so that would be the main challenge that I would speak of. That is particular to things like tenancy in common or joint tenancies.
I don't have anything to add on that, Dorian.
Thank you. I don't know.
Hi, Evan. Thanks for popping on. I was just messaging you to see how you like to wrap these things up. I'm glad that we didn't get shut down when the clock struck 6. So we could fit
I
that
think
last
we could
question
probably
in
go
at
on
least.
about these topics for all night, and I do appreciate you all coming out here. So much to dig into. We explored so many different corners of this huge conversation. And so I just want to thank not just today's presenters, but all of you for being out here this evening, engaging in this, sharing your thoughts, your perspective, and really coming at this question of what is a family farm, and what does land stewardship mean in a much broader, more dynamic context. And so I hope this conversation continues. I hope all of you can take what you learned here today and continue the conversation within your own community. A lot of resources shared today in the chat, a lot of links you should check out, a number of different organizations working in this space. So lots more to follow up on. And with that, thank you all so much. This concludes the very first day of the 38th Annual California Small Farm Conference. But we have 3 more days of virtual content, dozens more workshops, as well as our in-person gatherings taking place at the end of this week on Thursday and Friday. So I hope all of you will join us for one of those, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you all so much.
Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.